Yeah, what I'd like to do is to ask Dr. Peter Pry to join me, and we'll just sit down here and have a conversation because he was involved with this from the very beginning. And we're already a bit behind in our schedule. That's always true here. It's such a tight schedule. And maybe we can tighten the schedule up a little bit because both of our presentations we've been able to do here. Thank you very much for coming. Our microphones are on here? Okay. I really don't remember how I first learned about EMP. I have no memory of that. But I remember calling Tom Clancy, who was a friend and helped me in several fundraisers. I thought I was conservative until I met Tom Clancy. He was way out there. And I knew he did really good research for his books, and I was curious about EMP. And I knew he had an EMP scenario in one of his books, and so I called Tom Clancy. And he said, if you read my book, you know all I know about EMP. He said, let me refer you to the smartest man hired by the U.S. government. And in his view, that was a Dr. Lowell Wood. He may have been right, by the way, Peter. Dr. Lowell Wood from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. This was pre-cell phone days. Remember the old pagers? And the satellites, like Page Lowell Wood, thinking it would go to that satellite and down out in California. He happened to be in Washington, D.C., and within an hour he was sitting with me in my office. I really don't remember which year this was, but I was, and he described to me what would happen in the event of an EMP attack on our country. Newt Gingrich was then the kind of almost outgoing Speaker of the House, and we went and briefed Newt on it. And you may remember that in his presidential campaign, several times he mentioned EMP. I was his campaign advisor on EMP. I don't remember how long, let's see, it was Bob Livingston was the incoming speaker. Bob never quite made it there. He resigned and left, but we briefed him also. Using language I can't repeat here, he described how much it affected him and how frightened and concerned we ought to be as a nation. Well, I decided to set up an EMP commission, and Dr. Peter Pry was senior staff on the Armed Services Committee. And I don't remember Peter our first meeting either, but Peter had been involved with EMP in the CIA when he was there. We wanted to set up the EMP commission, and neither the chairman of the committee nor the staff director wanted anything to do with this, as you remember. And they said, gee, that would be nice, but we really can't do that because it would require sequential referral. We never do anything in armed services that requires sequential referral. What that means is it has to go to other committees because they also have jurisdiction here. And we're always the first bill out, and so we don't have time to do sequential referrals. So I said, what other committees would be involved? And they told me, and so I went to the chairman of those committees, and I got a letter waiving jurisdiction here. So then I came back, and we took this to them, Peter, and they very reluctantly, because they didn't want to do this, they very reluctantly put this in the bill, and the EMP commission was set up, and Peter was the chief staff member there, and it functioned for like 6 years, right? 8 years? Okay. 8 years. All right. Hope it's going to be reestablished now. The money is there, and Peter will spend a few minutes here as we discuss this, describing where we are now and what's happening now. There was something that overshadowed the report of the EMP Commission to the committee. Under was the chair, and it was a very perfunctory presentation. What was the event that overshadowed that?
I'm sure the thing you're referring to was it the Washington report on cybersecurity?
There was some big event that overshadowed that, and nobody paid any attention.
Maybe you're thinking about when you and Kurt Butler led the congressional delegation to Vienna to meet with the
yeah. Okay, that might be worth it. Now, what year was that? It was great on dates. I'm not very good.
That was the year, April of 1999.
April of 99. Okay.
And you met with the members of the Russian Duma.
We did.
Looking about how to possibly end
I'll tell you how to fix that date. It's the date when Slobodan Milosevic turned over the 3 prisoners hostage, or whatever we call them, to Jesse Jackson. And there was a picture of Jesse Jackson holding hands and standing in a circle and praying and Slobodan Milosevic. And the Secretary of State, to the dim view of of that. But we were in Vienna, Austria, in a hotel room there, negotiating the terms that would end the Kosovo conflict. Just a few days later, the GA adopted those. Kurt Weldon was the chair of our delegation. And by the way, Bernie Sanders was there, and Bernie Sanders and I sat like this through 3 days of these meetings, and there wasn't any light between us on this. Bernie's a very bright guy. He's a very decent guy. He's just wrong. The thing that probably helped me most as a congressman was my first degree was in theology, where I learned to love the sinner and hate the sin. So I can like people whose political philosophies I can't support. Nancy Pelosi was and is a good friend, and I've been on several codels with Nancy Pelosi. And Nancy, I really, really admire your commitment, but to all the wrong things. So I think that made it possible for me to like people in spite of what they stood for. As a person, she's a very decent person, but where she wants America to go is exactly the wrong place where America should be going. But what happened at room in Vienna, Austria? The ambassador to this country, Vladimir Lukin, was there. He was then the chair of their equivalent of Bartlett, the International Relations Committee or something like that. And he was very angry. He sat there with his arms crossed, a little or with short arms, looking at the ceiling for 3 days. He said, "Why did you spit on us?" Clinton had told them, "Gee, you know, we're the big guys now. You really don't count. We'll take care of this thing, the Kosovo thing." And the reality was that the Russians were the only people that deserved any conflict. In fact, the Russians told us, Peter, that whatever we decided with Russia, that the Serbs would agree to. That turned out to be true. Well, after about 3 days of this is what Vladimir Putin said. He said, if we really wanted to hurt you, we launched an SLBM with detonated nuclear weapon high above your country, shut down your power grid and your communications for 6 months or so. And Kurt Weldon said, did you hear what he said? Well, of course I heard it, didn't understand a word of it. Kurt did understand Russian, and so then the interpreter interpreted the thing, and then I knew what he had said. And then the third ranking communist was there, a tall, blonde guy. What was his name? Alexander Shabanov. And he smiled and said, if one weapon wouldn't do it, we have some spares. I think at that time about 10,000 spares, something like that, about what they had at that time. Well, this was quite a remarkable thing, and it got very little play in this country. Because here was a leading Russian saying publicly what they could do with a single weapon over a country. Peter, the reason I wanted to go is because I have some questions that I don't have any answers to, and maybe you can help me. You know, here is something that, if it happened, would end life as we know it. What Vladimir Putin said is exactly what would happen. It would shut down all of our communications. If you don't have electricity today, you don't have anything. The bank has no idea how much money you've got in the bank unless they look at a computer screen. The water won't come out of your faucet. Your sewage won't be treated. The financial institutions fall apart. You can't have any health care in the absence of this. Now, I grew up during the Cold War. I just went through my 90th birthday, by the way. I grew up during the Cold War. You could not go into a public building without finding there stacks of pamphlets telling you what you ought to do and how you ought to do it to prepare for this. And now we have something to end life as you know it. And here I'm having trouble understanding why, and how many years has it been now since the EMP Commission was set up?
8 years. Well, since it was established, 16 years.
16 years. And still, I talk, and most of the people I talk to know nothing about EMP. I don't understand how we can be in the leadership position and not tell our people that this thing is potential. The probability is not zero. I travel 20 years back and forth to Washington, and I go back and forth to Washington for 19 and a half years before I saw the first house on fire. And every house I passed, and there must have been, if you count each house, you know, hundreds of times that I passed millions of houses. Every one of them, I'll bet you, had fire insurance. Because what you do when there is a low frequency, very high impact event, if you buy insurance, a young husband that has kids and he buys life insurance because if he died his family would be devastated. For most people, if their house burned, it would devastate them, so you buy insurance. Why in the heck haven't we done the similar things done in this country? Why does the average person in our country today know nothing about EMP or what they ought to be doing to prepare for it?
Well, good question, sir. You know, in part, the government is partially responsible for that, I think. You know, because the information, when I was working on EMP and nuclear issues, nuclear weapons design issues, the CIA, all this stuff was deeply classified. And
Just one moment.
It's okay. Yeah,
CIA,
don't worry about it.
Most recent paper on EMP, it was Peter Cry's paper of a decade earlier.
Yes, that's right, a paper I written in 1987 at a briefing, at a hearing we had that was conducted in, I think, 1997 was the date of that hearing. And so, until the EMP Commission declassified in its reports, a lot of the information in its reports in 2004 and 2008, it just wasn't out there in the public sector. And then the hearings that were held with the EMP Commission, you know, weren't really well attended, and the press didn't pay a lot of attention to it. So it took some years before it started getting into the public domain. So that's part of it, the fact that the information and the threat had been deeply classified. But even after all of our educational efforts, and let's face it, there hasn't been that many of us engaged. I mean, the MPC, you know, my organization, you know, basically it's a handful of people who are knowledgeable about this, who've been going out trying to educate the public, talking to the press, and so there's just, you're starting with widespread ignorance, but also there's there's a great public skepticism because there used to be, I think science is less respected now because there have been so many hoaxes, or controversial positions taken, for example, over climate change. You know, where people will say, oh, well, 99% of all the scientists agree that climate change is a real phenomenon. And I'm not saying it isn't, and I'm not saying it is, all right? You know, but it's certainly not true that there's a consensus in the scientific community about climate change. And the average person, I think, is enormously skeptical. If they've been paying attention in their lives, they know that popular science was predicting a new ice age back in the 1970s, and the population bomb and all of that. And so when they hear the latest scare story, they don't know whether it's science fiction that they're being told or not. So there's a level of skepticism that people have now about claims about scientific disasters, you know, including in the cyber arena. You know, remember the 2000, in the year 2000, there was supposed to be a cyber catastrophe and it didn't happen. So people are kind of used to scientific and their government calling wolf, and that tends to make it hard to get through the, you know, through the skepticism. Last, I'd say, you know, the fact of the matter is, you know, I think it's been evidenced in the recent election. There's a tremendous left-wing liberal bias in the press. You know, and the press doesn't like to talk about, you know, threats to the United States from our foreign adversaries. Whenever they hear, especially, you know, they think that that's warmongering. It's going to be another excuse to get America into another unwanted war. What are we supposed to do? Invade Iran? Invade North Korea? You know, their immediate reaction to this is to deny it. You know, even though the threat is the explanation for the threat is basically bipartisan. You know, whenever, for example, you mentioned that Newt Gingrich had raised the threat during his first presidential election. I remember that very well. I was thrilled to hear here's a person for the first time in history during a presidential debate raising the threat of EMP. And you know what happened? The reward that Newt Gingrich got for trying to educate the American people and being so bold as to make this part of his presidential campaign, the very next day, a headline, front page of the New York Times, and an extremely caustic, critical article about Newt Gingrich and tinfoil on his head, and that everybody knows that this is a hyper threat that only the crazy right wing believes in. Okay, and I submitted. I got together a letter that was signed by the nation's leading intelligence and EMP experts, guys like Dr. Bill Graham, who had been President Reagan's science advisor, is the free world's foremost expert in EMP. He's the chairman of the EMP Commission. Jim Woolsey, Democrat CIA director, Chris Ehrmark, who had been the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, Lowell Wood, a dozen of our most prestigious strategic thinkers and scientists tell the New York Times, no, Newt Gingrich is absolutely correct. And they didn't even publish the letter. They wouldn't publish the letter. So this is the kind of an attitude you encounter in the press. Last year, in April of 2015, Ambassador Cooper and I published an article in the Wall Street Journal, about how the Obama administration is spending nearly $1 billion to pardon Cheyenne Mountain against a nuclear EMP attack from North Korea. And we're moving critical assets out of Peterson Air Force Base back into NORAD headquarters to protect them against EMP. And Wall Street Journal, now I consider the readers of the Wall Street Journal, they're not, they tend to be a bipartisan nature. I think that they tend to be among the more sophisticated and educated and informed people. And half the responses to that letter, in 2015, half the responses to that letter were, well, I didn't know EMP was real. I thought this was the stuff of science fiction. So even now, we have a huge educational mountain to climb, just convincing people that this is a real phenomenon, that this is something that they really have to worry about. So I think those are the factors. The fact that this has been, it's relatively new in terms of being unclassified and available to the public, that you've got a public that's much more skeptical now when they hear that scientists are making claims, because science has become so politicized in our society that the average person doesn't know, what's true and what isn't. And then you've got a real problem with press bias, that regards any foreign threat, as possible warmongering or setting us up for another unnecessary war. And people hadn't even read the EMP Commission reports, for example, and were claiming that the EMP Commission, what all this was about, was an attempt to bring back Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, okay? Now actually, I think Ronald Reagan's so-called Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative should be brought back as a response to this, but the EMP Commission reports didn't advocate that. What they advocated was a passive defense and protecting the grid, and they went through each of the critical infrastructures to explain how to do it. And so the press had obviously not even read the EMP Commission reports, but their theory about what this EMP was about was that it was an attempt to get us into another war, by having a preemptive war against North Korea or Iran, and an attempt to bring back the unwanted Star Wars program.
Peter, today there are other threats to the grid that would also bring it down, and even those aren't really publicized. Ted Koppel, in his new book, Lights Out, I went to visit him in his meeting with Ted Koppel down in Virginia, and I asked him what the probability was that this wouldn't happen. If you read the book, he claims that both Russia and China thoroughly hacked into our grid. At any moment they wished, they could take over the grid, do anything they wished with it, including shutting it down, destroying the grid. It's only a matter of time until the bad guys get there. And I asked him, what are the chances that this won't happen? He said, 0. So, this threat to the grid is a very real threat to the grid. And then the solar storm. The big Carrington event in 1859, the last really big one that would have taken down the grid is 1921. This happens about once every 100 years, roughly. I think that Lloyd's of London has a statistic that there's a 12% probability that within the next decade there will be a solar storm large enough to take down all or part of the grid. Even this hasn't gotten out there. The American people deserve to know that these threats are out there, that they can do something to protect themselves. Right now, and if you've read the book 1 Second After, there's a lot of good technical stuff in there, and it's woven into this novel so people will read it. But 90% of the people in the country are dead at the end of the year. That's probably not an unreasonable expectation if this thing happens. And I still, just need to ask why in the heck aren't the American people told that this is so? On the Armed Services Committee, they would come and North Korea is not really a threat yet because they don't have an intercontinental missile which will and Iran, they may be developing the bomb, but they don't have an intercontinental missile which will reach us. And I'm on the record, you can pull it up. I said, let me see if I understand. These people may be evil, they are not idiots. They're not going to launch from their soil. They know we have satellites that will see where this launch came from. And the response to that would be they would be vaporized. A little country in North Korea would be nothing but we could vaporize the whole country if they did that. Why would they do that and put themselves at that risk when all they have to do is a tramp steamer, a Scud launcher which they can buy for $100,000, and any crude nuclear weapon? It has an apogee of 180 miles that'll what? The whole East Coast, from Boston to Norfolk and maybe as far west as Chicago. I don't know if that's a mortal wound to our country, but it's close to a mortal wound. North Korea is launching satellites. What's wrong with putting a nuclear weapon in that satellite? If it's a 300-mile orbit and it goes over the United States, when it's over Iowa and Nebraska, and detonate the weapon. You know, don't tell me that we're not now at risk from Iran and North Korea. If Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, North Korea would be happy to sell them one. You know, why do they keep saying that we're not at risk from these countries until they've developed an intercontinental ballistic missile? Dear, why in the heck would they do that and put themselves at risk? We'll certainly know where it came from. We'll see it. And they can fly. We have, as far as I know, zero defense. We don't have defense in any quality or quantity up and down our coast. We're at zero defense against any weapon launched from a ship goes up our shore. Am I correct?
You are correct, sir. And I'd like to, let me, unsolicited from you, because you're too modest. You know, I'd just like to point out to people who may not be familiar with you with the role you play in this. You know, since we don't get to see each other that often, and here we are on the stage together after many years of working together. But I'd just like to talk a little bit about Mr. Bartlett and history of how EMP got started. Because we're all here in this room today, and then there was a national movement now to protect the grid against EMP and cyber and all the rest. And even the cyber movement owes its origins to Mr. Bartlett. Because the EMP issue is what started off the concern about grid security. And it was Congressman Roscoe Bartlett who started off a national movement to protect our nation against the existential threat that is EMP. And we met, I do have the memory, I remember it, you know, in February of 1995, you know, I had just come over from the CIA, where I had been their senior expert on EMP and on many other things, on Russian nuclear weapons and strategy. And I had been assigned to the task, the House Armed Services Committee professional staff. There's a professional staff and personal staff. There's a collection of technical and strategic and intelligence experts that serves basically all 60 members on the committee, and they assigned me to work with Mr. Bartlett and Congressman Kurt Weldon at the time. And the last thing I had worked on in the CIA was an event on the 25th of January 1995, which is to this day still not well known, but it's the closest we ever came to a nuclear war. You know, Norway has a space program that had launched a meteorological rocket to investigate the aurora borealis. Due to a clerical error, the Russian general staff hadn't been notified. And they thought that this was an attack, frankly. They thought it was an EMP attack. And it's the first time in history we ever had a ballistic missile in flight. And all three Chegets on the Russian side, they have three so-called nuclear footballs that can be used to execute their forces. And all three of them were executed. All three of them were activated. And two of the Cheget holders, Kolesnikov, who was the chief of general staff, and Grachev, who was the defense minister, were yelling at Boris Yeltsin to push the button. Any one of them could push the button independently, but they wanted the president to do it. And so they're supposed to push the button when the Chegets are activated. And he wouldn't do it. The whole thing lasted 20 minutes, but we were literally one push button away from a thermonuclear holocaust. And people over in Congress wanted to know, well, why is that? Why, with one meteorological rocket, you know, were they willing to push the button? Or did they come so close to pushing the button? And the answer was because with one weapon, you could do an EMP attack that would fry their command and control, and then it would be followed by a national first strike by us to take out their bombers and their aircraft and the like. And Mr. Bartlett was the only member of Congress who knew about EMP. And the EMP commission that we all give so much credit to, before there was an EMP commission, which wasn't established in 2001. There were 5 years of hearings. I mean, this man wandered in the wilderness, and he started off almost alone, and put up with a lot of ridicule and criticism from people for being concerned about EMP and the idea that, hey, the electric grid is critical to our national security. But slowly, by bringing in the facts, and having the first open hearings in history on the EMP threat, we were able to educate members of Congress and bring them along. And I think that the decisive moment came in that incident that you described in Vienna, when you had a bipartisan congressional delegation meeting with the Russian Duma about how do we end the Balkans War. Don't forget, the Balkans War was the first time NATO had actually gone to war, and we were bombing Serbia, which was a long-standing historical Russian ally. World War I got started because of Russian concerns about defending Serbia from aggression. A few months before that meeting, we had been told by the Clinton administration, by the Marsh Commission, which was a commission on cybersecurity, not to worry about the EMP attack. Mr. Bartlett had asked General Marsh, well, what about a nuclear EMP attack in addition to the cyber attack? And Marsh judged that, look, the Cold War is over, we don't have to worry about, Russia anymore, and only the major actors like Russia or China can even think about an EMP attack. And shortly after that, this bipartisan congressional delegation meeting with the Russians was threatened to its face with a nuclear EMP attack on the United States by Russia. And when they got back, the EMP Commission got established. And we started having our first meetings because it was clear that the defense and intelligence agencies, departments and agencies of the Clinton administration had dropped the ball, that they weren't paying attention to this threat, that this was something real. And indeed, when the commission met later, we found that just as we had suspected in the hearings that we had for those 5 years, that it wasn't just the Russians and the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, the Iraqis, that this was before Iraq had been conquered, but that they knew about EMP, and incorporated into their plans, and indeed, as we'll talk later, EMP and cyber and physical sabotage are actually all part of their plan. That they basically have developed this new way of warfare, in which the EMP attack is the ace. I mean, it's the most effective, most devastating thing, but if they plan to use it in coordination with cyber and physical sabotage attacks. And not only don't people know about EMP, but even more importantly, they don't know about this new way of warfare, sort of blitzkrieg in cyberspace, that is the basis for military thinking in Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and even among some terrorist groups if they can get their hands on the bomb. We are spending our time here in this country arguing about, well, what deserves higher priority? Cyber is more likely than EMP, isn't it? And then the Green Beret types and SEALs will tell you, well, a sabotage attack on the grid is even easier to do and more likely than cyber, isn't it? So we need to put all our resources into physical protection. No, it has to be cyber. No, listen, EMP, what about that solar storm? Isn't that what we should be preparing for? Oh, my friends, it's all of the above. It's all of the above. Anyway, go back to you, sir.
Thank you. Peter, why don't you tell us the additional things you're going to talk about, and maybe get our meeting here back on schedule. Go ahead with your 11 o'clock. And whatever it is what you're going to
okay.
Say now.
Well, you're the commander-in-chief, so I'll try to keep my remarks because I'm supposed to, and so George will take over that panel and have the time. Chuck wanted me to talk about where is the EMP Commission today, and and what are developments that are going on today. Well, the EMP Commission, I remember when we delivered our final report, and by the way, the House Armed Services Committee, the House, didn't want the EMP Commission to end. In fact, nobody wanted the EMP Commission to end. The Commission was supposed to continue past 2008. The idea was that it was to continue until the grid and the other critical infrastructures were protected. The problem is that the Defense Department didn't want to pay for it. The Defense Department said, well, the EMP Commission has done good service. It's enlightened us, and we agree with them about this EMP threat to our military forces, okay? But now the Commission is spending all its time looking at protecting the electric grid, the telecommunications system, and the water and food supply systems and the like, these civilian critical infrastructures. And this isn't our department. This belongs to the Department of Homeland Security. So we recommend that the EMP Commission continue to be reauthorized under the Department of Homeland Security. And we tried to do that, but unfortunately, and this is kind of inside baseball stuff, but because of sequential referral that Dr. Bartlett referred to, there has never been an authorization bill to the Department of Homeland Security that has ever passed Congress. You know, because the various committees, we never dissolved the committee chairmanships. There's still a committee of transportation, there's committees on electric power, banking and finance, and none of these chairmen, they always stop the authorization bill, you know, because they don't want to cede jurisdiction for their committee. So the authorization bill for the Department of Homeland Security never passes, and we had to reauthorize the commission through the authorization bill. So we were never able to, we tried and tried, and weren't able to do it. As a stopgap measure, I formed my EMP task force, which is like one of the lowest life forms of Congress, because the Congressional Advisory Board is nothing like a commission. It doesn't have power, it doesn't have resources. But finally, in frustration, and because the commission recommendations were being ignored for almost a decade, the Congress in 2015 brought the EMP Commission back, the original commission. And we were reestablished in November 2015, around Thanksgiving. And then, you know, we've done what we can, but to give you a sense of how perilous our situation is as a society, for the past year, ever since we were reestablished, you know, the Obama's Department of Defense has slow-rolled the commission. You know, they've been sitting on our money. We haven't gotten a penny of the $2 million that was appropriated to us. They finally gotten around. Not all of our staff have security clearances yet, you know, but they've been dragging their tails on getting security clearances. So basically, we've been established legally as a commission. We exist legally as a commission, but we have no resources to do any work. You know, we don't have security clearances so that we can go and look at the classified information. The President-elect of the United States has, a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was last week, directed the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, when I become president, I'm going to direct the Joint Chiefs of Staff to come up with a comprehensive plan to protect the electric grid and other critical infrastructures from cyber attack and all other threats. You'd think with such direction that would have made a difference, right? And that overnight, we would see the Department of Defense be forthcoming, since the next administration takes this stuff so seriously. But that hasn't happened yet. And nonetheless, we are continuing to do what we can, you know, on our own, on a pro bono basis. You know, we will not be thwarted from delivering a report. You know, Commission is going to deliver a report, and it's going to be cutting-edge analysis. I did a sample book that was published it's not a commission product, but it's the kind of analysis that I think Dr. Brain will agree we should go forward with. I just published a book through the Center for Security Policy called The Long Sunday, you know, nuclear EMP attack scenarios. And for the first time, it actually shows we've known EMP could be used not just against the United States, but against our foreign allies. And it goes through theater, Asia, Europe, North America, the Middle East, and talks about the various scenarios, how EMP attacks could be used to advance the geostrategic interests of our adversaries. It talks about using them in combination with cyber attacks and sabotage within those theaters. And it does, and this has cost me thousands of dollars of my own money. Okay, there's $2 million sitting for the EMP Commission, all right? But I've, out of my own pocket, paid to do this cutting-edge analysis where what we've done is shown what the consequences of an EMP attack would be in terms of what I call blackout zones. Most of the focus when people think of a nuclear EMP attack, they think of the EMP fields. But what isn't understood is the damage occurs way beyond the field. You know, the electric grid that's exposed to the field oftentimes will go outside the field. And so the total blackout zone actually propagates far beyond where the EMP field is. That's why you could take a balloon and put a 1 kiloton nuclear artillery shell in it, put it over the east coast of the United States. You know, it'll only have an effective radius of 600 kilometers. That's not covering any, it's a small, it's equivalent to maybe 5 states or something like that. But the effect will be to black out the whole eastern grid, you know, which would basically end us as a civilization, because we can't survive without the eastern grid. 75% of our electricity is generated in the eastern grid, and most of our population lives there. So understanding this concept of how does the damage from EMP propagate beyond the EMP fields. It's a kind of a new way of thinking about war, and this book shows in theater after theater, including in the United States, how that would work and how it would fold into the geopolitical and geostrategic interests of our various adversaries and various theaters of operation. Now, the other thing, and that I would say, to give you a sense of how bad we are, despite all these years of the EMP Commission, and all the efforts of groups like this to educate the public and to try to move the problem forward, is that while the EMP Commission is being stonewalled, the Obama administration's Department of Energy is going forward gung-ho with a project in cooperation with EPRI, that's the electric, well, that's one of the organizations, the think tank for NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, private sector corporation, that has been denying EMP threats, cyber threats, physical sabotage threats, and trying to reassure the public and the Congress that everything's all right, they're on top of the problem, these threats aren't really all that serious. Solar storms are greatly exaggerated. That has been EPRI's position. They've produced junk science that we have over and over again torn apart at technical conferences and demonstrated as false analysis. But we've been given $2 million that is sitting in the Department of Defense that hasn't been made available to the EMP Commission. While we've been being slow rolled with one hand, on the other hand, the Department of Energy and the electric power industry, basically, their lobbyists in EPRI, are spending $26 million to try to produce a report that's going to argue, well, the nuclear EMP threat isn't all that bad either. Just like the solar storm threat isn't that bad, the nuclear EMP threat isn't all that severe either. You know, because the first thing to provide the defense for these guys is always going to try to deny the threat, like they're trying to deny that the cyber threats are all that bad, or that they're on top of the problem. And the usual suspects are in charge of writing this. It's the same team that back in 2012 signed on to the NERC report that said, oh, the possibility of a solar superstorm blacking out the grid is greatly exaggerated, and that we would be able to actually claim that they would be able to bring the grid back in 24 hours after the event of occurring the event without doing anything. And fortunately, we tore them apart in a technical conference to prove that wasn't true. FERC ordered them to come up with a standard, okay, called the GMP standard, to protect against solar storms. And since FERC can't define what the standard is, they've come up with this standard. It's in effect a hollow standard, that will not protect the grid. So we're really no better off right now. And I'd say in some respects we're worse off, than we were when the EMP Commission started. Because not only have we not protected the critical infrastructures against the spectrum of threats, but we're now in a position where we have NERC, EPRI, other parts of industry propagandizing the American people who don't know who to believe. They're not scientific experts, and they've heard so much, but propagandizing American people and policymakers not to worry. There's nothing to worry about. Ed Koppel doesn't know what he's talking about. The EMP Commission doesn't know what they're talking about. And we, the utilities, are the real experts on all of these matters, when in fact they have no expertise on these matters. They have no expertise on EMP or cyber or physical sabotage effects. So in some respects, as to where we are today, we are worse off, because we've actually, the Commission, Congressman Bartlett established that, that is the tip of the spear for protecting our nation and Western civilization against the EMP threat is being stonewalled with one hand, and gross propagandists and people who don't know what they're talking about are being given $26 million to produce a report. I think you'll probably be reading about in the newspapers pretty soon. It's going to say, oh, new study that comes out from DOE and EPRI that says, well, we're on top of this nuclear threat, EMP threat, and maybe it isn't such a serious threat. Or more likely what they'll argue, they'll say, they like to use the phrase risk analysis, which is trying to make a virtue of a vice. And the essence of risk analysis is, well, what is the thing that's most likely to happen? Well, squirrels are much more likely to happen as a threat to the grid and EMP or cyber attacks. And it gives little attention to the consequences. And ignores the fact that we're very bad at analyzing likelihoods and probabilities. You know, it was one thing I know, you know, my original training was as a historian, and history tends to make fools of us all. You know, we're really bad at trying to anticipate what is the likelihood of threats. And when we've got 2 North Korean satellites orbiting over us on the optimum trajectory to evade our national missile defenses and do an EMP attack on this country, you know, I think the idea that that's a low likelihood threat is wrong. We know for sure the solar storm threat is inevitable. Anyway, I'm being told by Chuck that I'm over my time already, so thank you so much for hearing me out. Thank you.
Congressman Bartlett has a closing remark to make, and plus we have a presentation to him as well. So Congressman Bartlett, go ahead, please.
Okay, how many of you have heard of Yamantau Mountain? Wow, wow, okay. This is a very disquieting, let's just take a very brief time to tell you what, it's the largest nuclear secure underground facility in the world. It started in the days of Brezhnev, it's in Yamantau Mountain in the Urals, about 600 miles almost due east of Moscow. And it is huge. It is as big as inside the Washington Beltway. There are train tracks with trains running in 2 different directions. And we have no idea why they're building it. It's still there. The last brief I had, Peter said that what the Russians are going to do is take the cream of their civilization there so they can repopulate after a catastrophic event that wiped out essentially everybody else. Joel Skousen believes that I don't think this is true. I think there are plenty of other places to pursue biological and chemical weapons, which they say they're not doing, which I think they are doing. But you know, Yamantau Mountain, whatever they are doing in Yamantau Mountain is enormously disquieting. There is no good explanation of what they're doing in Yamantau. If you don't know something about it, read up on it. What it means is that Russia expects that there will be a cataclysmic event which destroys most of their people in order to put the cream of their civilization in Yamantau Mountain so that they can repopulate after this cataclysmic event. Couldn't that be disquieting? I think so. Thank you very much.
Now, Congressman Bartlett.